Okay, everybody, I'm going to pick up right where I left off. And that is on the New Republic lecture. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. That's the most important thing here. So here we are with Mr. John Adams, second president of the United States. Remember, we left off where Washington decided to retire. What a guy. The second time in his life where he had ultimate power. The first time was when he was general of the Continental Army. He could have easily, those men would have supported Washington no matter what. They would have followed him to their certain death. He could have just turned it on the Congress and arrested them and assumed absolute authority. It's unthinkable that he would do that. People today would say, oh, Washington would have never done that. Most men in that position could and in fact did do things like that. He didn't. He went home to Mount Vernon, lived his life, which what he thought was going to be just a permanent retirement. And just a few years later, in 1787, they asked him to be president of the Constitutional Convention. That Constitution was ratified, and then they begged him to be president, and he did. But after 8 years, he said, I'm going to retire again, give someone else a chance. What's important in this republic is that we don't have permanent hereditary monarchies, that instead we take turns, having different leaders, which is key and so important to us today, even though that's not in the Constitution at the time. It would be put later, the 22nd Amendment, to mandate you only serve more than 2 terms. They didn't have it at the time, and Washington, what a guy, retires in 1797, and he just leaves it to Adams and Jefferson and others to run. It's a very tight race, but John Adams comes out on top, and he will be the new president. Now, anybody who was following George Washington, that was a tough act to follow, and anybody would pale in comparison. And then, of course, John Adams will pale in comparison. But he was a great man, but very much plagued by the difficulties of running a republic. The first and the major thing that he has to deal with is known as the QuasiWar. Quasi is Latin for almost or as if. It was an almost war that we had with France. Remember that they're angered over Jay's Treaty, which we tilted towards Britain. We reduced the tariff for them so they can enter our markets with, a small reduction in the tariff. Whereas France had those full tariffs. Not only that, but we refused to join France in a war against England. Seemed to be going back on the treaty we signed with them in 1778, but we kind of argued our way out of it. Hamilton very shrewdly argued, well, that treaty was made with King Louis, so that treaty is no longer binding because that was a different government. King Louis is dead now in the early 1790s. So we do not side with the French. We do not give them the same trading status as Great Britain. And because of that, they started attacking our ships, our merchant vessels on the high seas. On the one hand, it was to get our attention, to sort of, provoke some sort of response out of us, maybe get us in order to stop all of this aggression. We might join them in a war. It would not work. And they also are hoping that this will choke the life, economically speaking, out of Great Britain. And it does not do that either. France's Navy was, although very impressive to us, a smaller, weaker country, it was not, overwhelming to Great Britain. So this is known as the QuasiWar, and it just overwhelms Adams' presidency. For 4 years, he didn't quite know how to handle this. Now, France is no threat to invade with an army of the United States, but it is very annoying to our freedom of the seas, our ability to trade with whoever we want, and he was very much plagued by this. Some $20 million worth of goods is seized by the French government at this time, 300 vessels taken over this way. So essentially, I think I mentioned this last time, the French Navy will patrol the Atlantic Ocean. Any ship flying any flag is commandeered. You holler at them through a bullhorn and you say, we, demand that we have the right to search this vessel. if the merchant vessel tries to flee, tries to run away, you shoot at it, you sink it, you disable it. Usually what would happen is that they would agree to be commandeered. They then look at the manifest and they say, these goods are bound for Great Britain. We are taking them because we're trying to choke the life out of Great Britain. And they did that some 300 times to $20 million worth of goods. We suspend diplomatic relations with them. Things start to heat up between us and the French. And this will culminate in what's called the XYZ Affair. So here's what this is. Adams sends, who will become later Chief Justice John Marshall, at this time he's just envoy or diplomat John Marshall, and sends him to Paris to try to negotiate with them. What happens there is, you know, the tip of the iceberg for this really big scandal known as the XYZ Affair. What happens essentially is John Marshall is told Foreign Minister Talleyrand will not even meet with you unless you bribe him first. And I forget the exact amounts, but they wanted some ridiculous amount of money, like $20 million or something like that, in loan guarantees just for the privilege of talking to Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Doesn't mean that he'll actually stop and cease and desist all of the seizing of vessels, but this is what they requested. Sort of a humiliating request that we bribe them. And Marshall basically says, well, you know, I don't have $20 million on me. I need to go back and ask the president. And so Marshall comes back, tells John Adams this, and it's all in writing. It's all, you know, we request X amount of dollars. And Adams just throws a huge fit. He's enraged at this. How dare they treat us like some vassal state, like we're a colony of theirs or something. And he prepares us for war. This is 1798. And so he says, we got to prepare for war. So he beefs up the Navy. He's very afraid of a standing army. Most founding fathers were, because it's expensive and it's a threat. Once you build this huge army, it's like, uh-oh, now it's got to be fed and equipped and trained. And if it gets restless and the officers decide to launch a coup, that could happen. So all of the founding fathers, except Hamilton, were always very afraid of having a standing army. But why not a Navy? That is less expensive and there's no threat of a coup on water. And so he starts building up this enormous fleet. If you're curious about naval warfare or any of this stuff, one of these ships still exists. It's in Boston Harbor. It's called the USS Constitution. Now, it was never used against the French, but the idea was we would build this huge fleet. The fleet would defend our harbors, but also escort our merchant vessels across the Atlantic. Unarmed vessels are easier to pick on, but once you start building a fleet to escort, then the French will start building a much larger fleet. So you've got this escalation on both sides that's rather frightening at this time. But you can go to Boston and take a tour of the USS Constitution. It's the oldest ship in the world that's still commissioned, meaning it's still an active naval vessel. Now, saying that, it's kind of ridiculous. We would never use this boat because it's an old sailing ship. It's, you know, very, very antiquated, but it's technically still in the Navy, and it does sail around Boston Harbor once a year, and it's super cool. If you're into history, if you're into, you know, old naval vessels, it's super cool to go aboard that, pretend that you're Jack Sparrow and stand at the wheel and, you know, pretend to be steering it. But this is the legacy of the Quasi-Wars. We still have one of these ships. The USS Constitution would not be used in the Quasi-War in 1798, but it would be used in the Barbary Wars in 1801. Made it all the way to North Africa and rained fire down upon Tripoli and won that war. And it also was used in the War of 1812 in several engagements against the HMS Guerriere, against the British, actually. So the XYZ affair essentially is the leaking out of this information. It was all supposed to be kept secret, what the French were doing and how they demanded this bribe. But John Adams felt, because he went to his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, and said, here's what they're doing. And Jefferson disbelieved him. He just said, come on, you're just trying to make the French look bad. They didn't do that. And he said, here's the diplomatic dispatches. Here's what they said. Jefferson couldn't even believe this. And so Adams said, all right, this will get everybody on my side, on the Federalist side. So he leaked it to the press, and the press published all these papers, and it worked. People were enraged at the French, unbelievably upset. Public opinion swings behind Adams and the Federalists. And so we're preparing for war. Now, the war never comes, but it was pretty frightening there for a little bit. And Adams' popularity was at an all-time high. All he had to do was ask for a declaration of war, and he'd probably get it after the XYZ affair. Why is it called the XYZ affair? Because the dispatches were released, but the names of the French agents who were behind this were protected. And so their names were taken out of the dispatches and replaced with the letters X, Y, and Z, because these were French diplomats living in America, in Philadelphia, and nobody wanted to see them lynched or killed or anything. And so that's why it's called the XYZ affair. But essentially, it was a shakedown of France by, or of us by France. And people were unbelievably upset over it. So Adams really overreached on this. What he should have done is try to keep us out of war and just negotiate. But instead, he beefed up the Navy as big as he could. And then he cracked down on dissent at home. And this was a huge mistake. He and his Federalist allies in the House and Senate passed a very strict series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. So what this basically did is it made a crime to criticize the government, the Adams administration, in any way. If you were an American citizen, that would be sedition. Sedition means disloyalty, right? So you use your words to try to convince other people to be disloyal to the United States. That's what it means, basically. Now, it's not usually a crime. We believe in freedom of speech in this country, typically, and we have a First Amendment that's supposed to protect it. In fact, the ink probably isn't even dry yet. The First Amendment was written in 1791. Here it is 7 years later, just 7 years later, 1798, and the federal government is saying freedom of speech, but shut up. Don't say anything nice about the French, and don't criticize me, John Adams. Now, one has to sort of forgive John Adams because you have to understand that at that time in 1798, this was the first republic that had existed in a long time. And yes, Holland was a republic, but they still had a king. They still had an established church. We didn't have any of that stuff. And Adams' honest feeling was, it's not about me and my feelings. It's the fact that if you criticize this government, it will just fall apart. What's the glue that will hold us together? We don't have an established church. We don't have a monarchy. The government's not held in this high esteem. You can criticize me like you can criticize anyone else. And the press was merciless against John Adams. They called him fat. They called him toothless. They called him bald. One newspaper, I am not joking, called him a hermaphrodite, which is not a very nice thing to call your president. He tried not to take it personally, but he honestly felt this kind of talk going on and on and on forever, no one would respect our government at all, and it would just fall apart. And he felt he had to lead the country. So these were pretty stiff penalties, you know, several $1,000 fines and or imprisonment for criticizing the Adams administration, which that gave all the ammunition that he could to Jefferson. Jefferson, over this series of laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts, will retire as vice president, go home to Virginia, and start an opposition party. He and James Madison feel that the Federalists have gone too far, that we needed a constitution, and we, united the country behind this strong central government, but the pendulum had swung in the other direction. Now it was too unified, too strong. The states had no rights, and they had to get rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts. They just had to. So Jefferson founds really the first political party in our country's history. They call themselves the Republicans, but understand it's not the Republican Party of today. There are some similarities between them. This is technically actually the Democratic Party of today. That's the lineage, right? It starts with Jefferson and Madison in 1798. It will change names in the 1830s from the Republican to the Democratic Party, and then it remains the Democratic Party from the 1830s until today. This is the party of the donkey, okay? So, what was the tenets of this political party? It was anti-monarchist, right? The idea was to call themselves Republicans, saying this is a republic. We believe in freedom and democracy, even though democracy is technically a bad word at the time, the way we use it, right? Power to the people, you know, elections, weak central government power to the states. This is what Madison and Jefferson decide to do. Now, they also passed what's known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This is really interesting, and this will come up over and over again. We know that governments will violate the Constitution, right? Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers that the Bill of Rights is a mere parchment barrier, meaning you can write down Congress can't violate freedom of speech, but that's just words on a piece of paper. How will you actually execute the remedy in a real world situation? What if your rights are violated, which clearly you have it here? I'm a big fan of John Adams, but the Alien and Sedition Acts were absurdly ridiculous in terms of them being unconstitutional. We have a First Amendment that says freedom of speech. Congress passed the law. How do you fix it? This is the key. You can write down all day long what your rights are, but you don't actually have a constitution that's progressive or works unless there's a mechanism to enforce it. Now, because the Constitution was so new, nobody really knew what the solution was. There are all kinds of theories, but understand the Constitution is not one man's vision. It was an amalgamation, a watering down of 55 different men who went to that convention. Yes, we can say, well, Madison wanted this and Hamilton wanted that. Yeah, they're just two men out of 55. It's more than that. The Constitution is more than just, you know, one man's ideas. Now, one idea was that the states could just block federal laws that they felt were unconstitutional. Sounds reasonable until you start toying with this idea, and then you can pick it apart very easily. Okay, so California doesn't like President Trump's policies. That means we can just block the enforcement of federal law. If we don't like a war that President Bush got involved with, can we just refuse to send troops to that conflict? Can we shut down the military bases? What about the post office? Can we just get rid of those if we don't like them? There's federal courts in our territory. Can we get rid of those? And on and on and on. Hopefully you get what I'm saying, which is that if you do allow states just to totally ignore and violate federal law, you don't really have a country. That's not a process that's going to work. And certainly not when you just make it a whim. Like, you can, you know, block the enforcement of federal law anytime that you want. There's no process or anything like that. Well, that's what Madison and Jefferson thought. They thought this law was clearly unconstitutional, so states can actually overturn these laws within their boundaries, right? So Virginia and Kentucky actually passed laws that tried to overturn the federal laws and said the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are null and void in our states. And here's where it gets really scary. Federal marshals trying to enforce those laws in our states will be arrested by the federal or by the state police. So this is where it gets really tricky. Can you imagine if LAPD said, hey, Trump administration, we don't like these policies that ICE is doing, and we're going to arrest Immigration and Customs Enforcement? That's civil war right there, where you have the agents of two different levels of government using force against each other. That's tricky. That's a tricky situation. Well, for a while there, that was one thing that states tried to do is nullify. This is known as the doctrine of nullification. They tried to nullify or block federal policy this way. Now, Adams, I think very wisely, did not escalate. Hamilton wanted him to. Hamilton said, goody, now we can go arrest Madison and Jefferson, go send the army into Virginia and have them arrested. And Adams just said, that is insane, right? They don't tell you that in the musical. Hamilton had quite a few sort of authoritarian impulses and had a few crazy ideas as well. Adams doesn't do that. Adams just holds his fire, keeps his powder dry, and says, you know what? We don't need to make a huge issue of this. We're not going to enforce the law in Virginia and Kentucky. I don't want to risk a civil war. So they didn't escalate it. We'll talk more about nullification later. As a doctrine, it completely falls apart during the Civil War. But it was an interesting idea, and some people thought that is the remedy. What is the remedy nowadays? Just, you know, as a slight aside, the remedy is that you file suit in federal court. This is very appropriate. We have, you know, Supreme Court hearings now. Amy Coney Barrett is being, you know, nominated to the Supreme Court. This is why people are paying attention to it, because if your rights are violated in this republic, and let's say it's, 1800, and you're going to be arrested or fined for something that you say politically, like, I think the president is fat, bald, whatever, and you're arrested, you don't get the state of California to block federal enforcement. You file a suit in federal court. You sue the government, basically. And the federal courts should, if they're behaving correctly, should defend your rights. Hamilton writes about this in Fed 78, which is probably Hamilton's greatest moment. As a historian, I can look at it and say that it's wonderful what he wrote in that. Much better alternative than just having the states block it. So we then have the election, or what's often called the Revolution of 1800. And here's what that is. So Adams runs for re-election, and Jefferson and several other people run against him, and Adams loses. Now, part of the reason why he loses is the Alien and Sedition Act. It was very unpopular, but even despite that fact, historians now know that if we didn't have that 3/5 compromise, Adams would have won, meaning South Carolina is getting to count 60% of its slaves in terms of proportionality, so they get more electoral votes. Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, all of these slave states get to beef up or power up their Electoral College numbers because of their number of slaves who legally are property and don't have an interest under the law, but slave states want to count them nonetheless. So Adams probably should have won this race. He will not. He'll come in third. And Jefferson and Aaron Burr tie. Now, Aaron Burr is someone who's largely been lost to history, but because of the musical Hamilton, we know a lot about him. Interesting figure. And the musical is fairly accurate, telling you about himself. He was a guy who very much was without principle, didn't really believe in much of anything other than just power, and that's what he wanted. He wanted to become president because he thought it'd be cool to have all kinds of power, but he didn't have too many ideas. He switched parties, right? He was a Federalist, and he could kind of see which way the wind blew, and he could see that, the Republican Party was in 1799 and 1800 was becoming much more popular, so he switched parties. That's why Hamilton couldn't quite stand the guy, because Hamilton, as the saying goes, wore his heart on his sleeve. You didn't have to ask Hamilton, too hard, like, how do you feel about an issue? He just came out and told you constantly, incessantly. Whereas, as the song says, wait for it, Burr would hold his, cards close to the vest, not tell people how he felt, and kind of bide his time and wait. And in 1800, that's what he did. Now, he had what today doesn't mean much of anything, but it meant a lot in 1800, and that's that he had a great pedigree. On both sides of his family, he had these very famous people. Jonathan Edwards from the First Great Awakening was his grandfather. Family members on both sides were very wealthy, very well-to-do, and this doesn't really matter anymore. I mean, in fact, we're sort of rebelling against it. If that did matter, probably Jeb Bush would be president right now, but Jeb Bush went down in flames in 2016 because Donald Trump basically said, we don't want dynasties anymore. We got the Clintons, we got the Bushes. We don't want these political dynasties in America anymore. We want, to have a choice, to have new families come about, right? And so that meant a lot in 1800. Burr came very close to winning. He tied with Jefferson on 37 separate ballots, meaning that you hold the election. If the election, like nobody has a majority in the Electoral College, okay, our Constitution gets very confusing here, but essentially each state has a number of electoral votes, and nowadays the way it works is your popular vote then activates a slate of electors for your electoral votes, right? California has 55 electoral votes, can guarantee Joe Biden's going to win it next month, and he's going to get all 55 electoral votes. They're sort of indivisible. They go as a block. Back in 1800, there was no popular vote for president, just state governments met and they said, who do we award all of our electoral votes to? And that's how it worked. And in the Electoral College, it was Um, Forgive me, I don't remember if it was a tie or if just nobody had the majority, and if nobody has a majority, it goes to the House. Then it went to the House, and they voted in these state delegations, and it deadlocked 37 separate times. So it looked, going into February of 1801, it looked like we might not have a president. We don't know what's going to happen. This was really scary stuff. And as the musical tells you, Hamilton got to play kingmaker here. Now, Hamilton did not like either of these two men, Jefferson or Burr, but he basically said, and I'd have to agree with him, that Jefferson, Hamilton felt was a fool. He had his head in the clouds. He was, had this crazy idea that everybody would be a farmer and that was the future of America and we needed all this land in the West. States deserve all these rights, et cetera, et cetera. Jefferson would create this inefficient, terrible government and policy. But as a lot of people, have sort of figured out throughout American history, there's something more important than policy. You may be a Democrat, you don't like the Republicans or vice versa, but more important than policy is process. That you have a fair democratic election, that your president obeys the law, etc. And Hamilton really felt that Burr was a scoundrel, that he believed in nothing other than himself and his own raw power. And so Hamilton meets with these House delegates and he says, if my word counts for anything, it's silly just to keep voting for John Adams because he comes in third all the time in all of these, subsequent races. So throw your support behind Jefferson. He's a fool, but he's an honest fool. So Hamilton got to play kingmaker, and Burr loses, Adams loses, Jefferson wins. Third president of the United States. He's on Mount Rushmore. Now, why is it called the Revolution of 1800? Well, two reasons, basically. Number one is that this was the first time ever in American history where the party in power, right, Adams was the sitting president and a Federalist, lost and walked away. This is something that we take for granted in America. Of course, you lose, it's automatic. You just step down, right? There's a lot of countries where it doesn't happen this way, where presidents lose and they don't go gracefully. They just claim that they won. Civil wars will emerge because, factions sort of take to the streets. It's rather incredible. America has this very fine tradition of a peaceful transference of power. Elections are sort of simulated civil wars. As Lincoln said, we fight our civil wars with ballots, not bullets. It's kind of ironic because that was an early Lincoln quote. Lincoln actually was president during an actual civil war. But the notion was that we don't use violence. We don't need a revolution or a civil war to get the point across. We have peaceful elections. Adams, whatever you think about him and, the Alien and Sedition Acts or anything else that he did, he took it like a man, took it like an adult, however you want to say. And he stepped down and he said, I concede. Concede means I withdraw the contest. I lost. I admit that I lost. And I call upon all my followers to step aside and support Jefferson. You don't have to support all his policies. We're going to be now the loyal opposition. That's a saying in a democracy, is that we don't have enemies, right? It's not like, well, I'm a Democrat and, the president's a Republican, so we're going to overthrow the government. No, we're called the loyal opposition. We criticize the president, but that's not criticizing America or the Constitution or the government. That's just criticizing the administration that's in power right now, the loyal opposition. So it's a revolution in that sense, that the side that actually was in power lost and stepped aside, and you didn't have a civil war or coup or revolution or anything. It was rather wonderful. The other reason it's called a revolution is that there was a social revolution that started right around 1800. And here's what's meant by that. It sort of coincides with Jefferson becoming president. So here's what's meant by that. America was a very young country in 1800. And I mean that in both senses. Like, we had just had a revolution 25 years before and we're a new nation. but also the people in it were very young. Not like today, where life expectancy is so much longer and birth rates have declined. So therefore, you have a lot of retired people in America. I think there's actually more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 25 in this country. It was not that case 200 years ago. 220 years ago in 1800, most people, the vast majority, like 3/4, were under the age of 30, meaning they had no memory of America under British rule. We declared independence in 1776. So by 1800, very few people actually remember the British Empire. The older generation did, but that was a tiny fraction. That was fewer than 1/4 of Americans remember that. Most Americans were raised being told from when they were babies, you are not a subject of a monarch. You are a free man or a free woman. Think for yourself. Question authority. Don't accept what everyone tells you just because they tell you. You're a free man, a free woman. Think for yourself, which is a very dangerous notion to teach people. And it's quintessentially American. And so many Americans grew up with this sort of belligerent attitude. Don't tell me what to do. I'm going to think for myself. It's a very American kind of attitude. I simultaneously love it and hate it because on the one hand, it's a bit healthy not to totally just respect what elites say and to think things out for yourself. The problem is certain things are very complex and a lot of Americans want to try to think it out for themselves. Like this is the only advanced country on earth where global warming is still debated because so many Americans don't understand it and they just say, well, I don't trust you. You have all these PhDs next to your name, but who cares? I'm just going to go ahead and doubt it. And there's many instances of that as Americans just don't respect elite opinion. In some situations, it would be good to respect some scientists, you know, things like that, historians, etc. But people instead say, well, I saw a YouTube video and it said da 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 da, and I just accept it anyway. So we're a very young country in 1800. People were thinking for themselves. And so old places of authority had all melted away. There was no king. There was no Anglican church anymore. And those areas just dissipated. And so you had some really worrying trends going on in America at the time. I'll give you a few examples. Number one, alcohol consumption rates went off the chart. Now, they already were pretty high, and this is because it's very hard to get clean water 220 years ago. You had to, dig a well and pump water out, and often water would be contaminated. You'd have to boil it in a tea kettle and then wait for it to cool off, and that was just a lot of work. So even doctors would say, don't drink water, it's really bad for you, you should drink alcohol. Alcohol, as bad as it is, it literally kills germs, right? And so people would drink quite a bit, 4 or 5 drinks a day minimum. That went up in the early 1800s, believe it or not. People were drinking probably 7 to 9 drinks a day. We know because of the excise tax, we know how much people were drinking because we knew how much was produced, we know how much was exported, and you just do simple subtraction to figure it out, that the average American adult male was drinking 88 bottles of whiskey per year, which is a bottle every 4 days pretty much, which is just an insane amount of liquor. It's not good. It's very unhealthy for your liver. It's very unhealthy for the heart. It's going to contribute to accidents. It's rather extraordinary. If you look at arrest reports, most people that are arrested in this country are under the influence of something because you make really bad choices when you are drunk or high or whatever, right? Is that most people who are apprehended by police are either drunk or under the influence of something, and they've made a very bad choice. And so this would compound itself, right? Is that alcohol consumption rates were very high. So was violent crime. Is that Americans kind of have always had this reputation of being a very violent society. Now, that's not as much true today. We do have problems with, gun violence and mass shootings and stuff like that. But if you actually look at lower level, like petty theft, we're not any worse than most other countries. But it certainly was true 220 years ago, especially in the West, where it was kind of hard to find a constable to deal with the problem that you have. People were getting in fistfights, and that's how they were solving issues. Alcohol consumption rates meant that the illegitimacy rate went up. This means that a lot of men and women were having kids without getting married, and that shocked people. The illegitimacy rates were so high that the US would not reach them again until the 1960s, because there was no Anglican clergy to point their finger at young men and women saying, hey, get married before you have kids. That evaporated. Now, there were still churches, but especially in Virginia and throughout the South, the Anglican church just disappeared. It's associated with the British now, and nobody was a member of it in America anymore. And so that source of social control just disappeared. And so people just said, I'm going to do what I want. Now, we know this because midwives, these are women that delivered children before there were hospitals. People just be born at home, and midwives would keep journals, and they would always write down there who the father was. And in a shocking number of cases, they say no father present, no father present. 9 times out of 10, when the father wasn't present, they had moved out west where land was cheap. This is particularly true in New England, Puritan New England, right? You know, children born out of wedlock. And this was because land was very scarce in New England. The soil was really bad. And so husband or dad of the child would move to Ohio, mom would stay behind. So you had these weird gender imbalances where in Ohio, there was like 2 men for every 1 woman. In New England, it was the reverse. There were more women than men because all the men were leaving and going west, and usually getting their girlfriend pregnant first before they left. Shocking in 1800 that this happened, but it was happening quite a bit. Lots of fist fights. College campuses were out of control. Jefferson had to actually, he wrote a check and created University of Virginia, and he had to return to this university because he just sort of wrote a check and had someone else run it. He had to return and give this address to all the kids because there were riots on the campus. Many problems like this are going on throughout America at the time, and this is why it's also called the Revolution of 1800, because the ethos, the spirit of Jefferson was do whatever you want. This is a democracy, freedom, Now, what will happen is a reaction to this. The Second Great Awakening emerges largely to deal with all of these problems. And there were many problems. And so the temperance movement was a movement within churches to get men to stop drinking as much, right? Pledge in front, they would get men up there and guilt them. And they'd say, pledge in front of the congregation and God and everyone else that you're going to stop drinking, or at least drink a lot less. And pledges like that were taken all over the place. New denominations popped up all over America. The Baptists, the Methodists, just take off like wildfire in every section of the country because it filled a void. There was a need for people to kind of hear from somebody what was acceptable in society, because a lot of people were not, playing by these rules. So let's talk about Jefferson politically. Here's the great man. He's up on Mount Rushmore. He had this idea of Republican agrarianism. In a true republic, every citizen must be a farmer, an independent. Had his head in the clouds, right? If we look to Hamilton, his version of the future actually came to a reality. All of us living in cities, big mercantile empire, right? We live right next to the largest port in America, the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach combined. Living in cities, banking center, that's what actually happened in reality. But, Jefferson had these dreams that we'd all be farmers, we'd all be independent, the states would have more authority. That's not the America that eventually will emerge. But for a while there, he had this, opposing view, and it, wasn't going to hold the day, but it was an alternative view that Americans could get behind. So by far, Jefferson's most important contribution as president was the Louisiana Purchase. So let's talk about this. Now, from Pinckney's treaty, we know that the biggest, most important lesson of that was that New Orleans is the key to North America. If you control New Orleans, you control the entire middle third of the country. Spain had it in the 1790s. France would reacquire it when Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor in 1800. He would kind of bully Spain into giving it back. But France really had no idea what to do with Louisiana. They didn't really want it. They were in the middle of this huge war. And Napoleon's key inclination was just to sell it to get quick cash. And that's what he did. Now, Jefferson gets a lot of the credit here, but so many things in life, it's just sort of right place, right time. Was he the best negotiator in the world? No, right place, right time. Number one, France was desperate. Napoleon needed cash. He didn't really need Louisiana. He knew we wanted it. And so at first, Jefferson just says, hey, we'd like to buy New Orleans from you. And Napoleon counteracts with, how would you like all of Louisiana, this huge middle third of the country? Second, what really helped Jefferson out was his history. He was a Francophile, and Napoleon knew that. He loved and adored the French and was sticking up for the French at every chance he got for the last 40 years. And Napoleon was much more okay selling that off to a President Jefferson than he probably would have been to a President Hamilton, for instance, who absolutely loved and adored the British. So Jefferson acquires this huge chunk of land. It doubles the size of the United States overnight, peacefully, and it does it for a very low price of just $15 million, which was a good chunk of money back then, but for the middle third of the country, it was astonishing. So let me show you guys the map right here. When I say Louisiana, I don't mean the little state of Louisiana. So America at the time was this area, right? Everything from Maine down to Georgia, everything from Georgia over to here, the Mississippi River, up to the Great Lakes. This right here was America. Now, Louisiana is this area, everything up to the Rocky Mountains here, to the Canadian border, to the Mississippi River. This is a huge area, and Jefferson got it from the French for a low, low price. So hand it off to Jefferson. That was pretty incredible. Things heat up at the Supreme Court. As I said, Jefferson had this kind of bizarre notion that states could just violate federal law if they didn't like it. And you have this very bizarre case that we don't need to get to the ins and outs of because the facts of the case are very complex and they're just not that important. Marbury versus Madison. What you need to know is essentially this case would decide that question of if the federal government does violate the Constitution, what's the remedy? And it turns out the remedy is to file suit in federal court, which happens here, and which was the first case ever where the Supreme Court struck down an act of Congress, or at least part of an act of Congress. They struck down part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which you don't even need to know that. What do you need to know? Marbury versus Madison gives us judicial review. Marbury versus Madison, most important case in Supreme Court history. Why is it the most important? Because it gives us judicial review. John Marshall, the new Chief Justice, said emphatically, that's what the Supreme Court does. And that's all that it does, is it nullifies laws that are unconstitutional. Federal laws, state laws, whatever, but if governments under this Constitution violate the Constitution, we are here. That's what we do. If someone files suit, we strike it down. That's what the British system did. That's what Hamilton said in Fed 78. And guess what? That's what we do here. So it's a super important case. That's all you need to know about it. The rest of Jefferson's presidency is rather messy. His second term especially is very, very difficult. So he is dealing with the opposite problem that Adams did. Adams actually solves the Quasi-War in the late stages, like in December of 1800, the last month or so of his presidency. A treaty is made with Napoleon, and France and America make peace. As soon as that happens, Britain then turned on us for making peace with France, and they begin a policy much more aggressive than anything the French did, and it will be called impressment. So here's impressment. It sounds terrible when you first hear it, but when you actually look at the facts, there's a reason why the British did it, right? It's very funny to read about these conflicts in an American textbook, and then you read about it in Britain, and you go, oh, maybe we are the bad guys here. So here's what happened. Impressment is essentially the kidnapping of American sailors and putting them into the British Navy to go fight Napoleon. Now, when you say that, you say, that's terrible, that's inexcusable, how dare they? Well, hold on a minute. Here's the way this would happen. Britain's at war with France. They're the only country at war with France. Napoleon has conquered all of Europe. And if Napoleon could master the English Channel for 6 hours, he could march an army all the way from Dover in the southeast all the way to London and conquer all of Britain, and then he would conquer all of Europe. They would not be a democracy anymore. They would be this, you know, vassal state to Napoleon. The only thing protecting Britain is their navy. And their navy has very high desertion rates. They have a draft, so like young men will be forced into the British Navy, they'll get their training, they'll get on a boat, they'll go chase the French Navy all over the globe, and then they have to go to port. So there's certain friendly countries that let them do that, right? They'll go to Boston and they'll get out and they have shore leave for 2 or 3 days while the ship gets more supplies and, you know, the soldiers get to rest. Now, you go to Boston, it's a big shipbuilding city, and you're a British officer or a British enlisted man, and you just say, man, life sucks. This is really rough being in the war. I don't like it. And then you go to a tavern or a bar in Boston and you meet all these guys on a merchant crew. They're making money hand over fist. This is great times in the 1790s, early 1800s to be an American sailor, because Britain and France basically aren't transporting goods across the Atlantic. They're paying Americans to do that because they took every single ship they had and converted it to a war vessel to go kill each other. Americans, on the other hand, don't have a big navy. They're at peace and they're building these big, beautiful merchant vessels. And they have these crews that ship goods back and forth, and they're making so much money. Easy to find work. And it's a lot safer than getting shot at by the French. Now, it's very easy just to disappear. You take your uniform off, you buy, you know, American clothes somewhere in Boston, and you just join one of these merchant crews. You speak the same language, it'd be very easy to disappear. And this is what the British were dealing with, is mass desertion rates. Most of these sailors disappearing and joining American merchant crews, making much more money and being much safer. And the British felt, we need to track these people down. And if the American government isn't helping us, we'll just do it on our own. What are they going to do? Are they going to complain? Because they had the mightiest navy in the world. They could just commandeer our ships, but they're not looking for cargo. They're looking for deserters. And so what we saw was, we didn't care how these individual sailors became American. They were American, right? They took the citizenship test and they became Americans. The British had this notion, those are not Americans. Maybe they were an American for all of 2 weeks, but they were British sailors who defected and left, and we're tracking them down. So you have two sides to this, right? Now, the British did this. Do I have the statistic here? Impressment. Yeah, they did this some 6,000 times. And you would have to believe that they were not accurate in every single case, is that in some cases they grabbed the wrong person. And that's something really to be upset about, because in that case, they were indeed kidnapping Americans. Now, what about the others? What about the main thrust of all of this? Is it okay for the British to go and commandeer American vessels in the search for deserters to try to kidnap them? Or is America's point of view correct, which is, hey, you should have held on to those sailors better. That's not our fault. And now they've defected, now they're under American protection, and you better back off. They didn't take us seriously. They just kept doing this, and Jefferson was just befuddled. For years, he complained, and then he finally settled on just about the stupidest thing that you could do to get back at them. He complained, he ranted, he raved, he had all kinds of, you know, solutions, but none of them would work. Finally, he had this notion, all right, what we will do is what we did in the 1760s. I remember that. Remember when the British taxed our stamps and then we boycotted their goods and it brought them to their knees and they peacefully changed their minds. They changed their policy. Well, we don't have to ask politely now. I'm president. I control all the ports. I can just say no one may trade with Great Britain and force them to. And his Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of War said, Mr. President, that's just not going to work, because sure, you can say we won't buy British goods, but guess what? Dutch merchants will buy British goods and then they will bring them to America on their ships and sell them. And there'll be a small markup on those, you know, goods, but they'll be sold right here in America. Jefferson said, oh yeah, you're kind of right. Jefferson didn't have the mind for trade or banking. He didn't understand it all. He spoke 5 languages and was an inventor, but really banking and finance really, and trade really befuddled him. He didn't understand it very much. So he said, all right, tell you what we'll do. We will just shut ourselves off completely. No ships in, no ships out. And everybody was just shocked. They just said, that's insane. We would starve to death if you did that. No trade at all. And he said, well, look, I'm not saying to do it for 10 years. All you need is 3 months and the British Empire will be brought to its knees. And so against the advice of all of his cabinet members, Jefferson went ahead with this crazy scheme, and it was disastrous. Number one, it didn't work. It didn't work. This would be today, like if a very poor country, like let's say Nicaragua, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, was mad at US policy and said, we're not going to buy your goods anymore. America wouldn't even notice because they're not a major trade partner, right? And we're the powerful country, they're the weak country. We have leverage over them saying we won't trade with you. And then they're like, okay, we'll behave, right? In the 1800s, in the early 1800s, we were like Nicaragua today. We were a country threatening to shut off trade with Great Britain. It was insane. And we did it. It wasn't effective. Didn't get the British to change their policy, barely affected them at all. Second, it devastated our economy. It had like no effect on the British, but especially on New England. The people just thought the president had lost his mind. Employment takes a huge hit. Shipping industry takes a huge hit. Manufacturing takes a huge hit. Everybody was just befuddled by like, whoa, what are you doing? This is insane. It's a self-inflicted wound and you're hurting us. Third is that this was, I mean, you talk about tyranny, and Jefferson, with big crocodile tears was saying, oh, the Alien Sedition Acts are terrible. How can you do that? Okay, thanks, buddy. I'm almost done. So he felt, Jefferson did, that the Alien and Sedition Acts were just the worst thing in the world, violates freedom of speech. If you actually look at the nitty-gritty details, not that many, I forget, the last time I looked was years ago, but it's actually kind of surprising. You look at it and go, oh, like 8 people were arrested and like 12 fined. It wasn't what you might imagine. Now the policy's shocking because it's like, you can't speak against the president, but when you actually look at the enforcement, it was minimally enforced, barely at all. This policy, on the other hand, was widespread and rather strict and draconian. So meaning this was a policy that said no ships out or in to any American harbor for a year. Now, he thought it would only last a couple months. No, it lasted the entire year. The Embargo Act of 1807 lasted from December 1807 to December 1808, had no effect on the British, destroyed our economy, and it lasted a year. Imagine your city of Long Beach, no ships in, no ships out for an entire year. Boston Harbor completely devastated their economy. And it violated Jefferson's own notions of freedom, which part of it, he had read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and agreed that part of freedom was being able to buy, sell, trade with whomever you wanted to. There's this story of a little town in Vermont called St. Albans. And technically their entire economy is in international trade because they're right on the border with Canada, and that's what they do. The young girl in the family gets up, collects the eggs from the hen, she crosses the bridge in the morning, and she sells those eggs at market. Well, guess what? She's in Canada when she's doing that, and that's international trade. Now, there were American soldiers stationed on that bridge and every other bridge leading into Canada and said, no, you may not trade with your neighbors. That's how people saw it. I'm just trading with my neighbors. I'm not in some kind of international trading scheme. No ships were allowed to leave any harbor. None. So again, I'm a big fan of Jefferson. I think he was a great man and a great president, but we all have a bad day at the office. And this was his low moment, was passing the Embargo Act of 1807. It was ridiculous. It was preposterous. It made him a hypocrite because it was, the greatest violation of freedom our nation had ever seen up to that point. And it didn't solve anything. It was pretty ridiculous. Okay, I'm going to chop this up into a third lecture. This one will be a little bit short, this version here, but I'm going to wrap up the War of 1812 and the last slide on another lecture, okay? All right, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you enjoyed. See you later.